Hello again, time to make a new video. Today we shall talk about the economics of slavery. Now, when you think of slavery, I hope you think it's bad, or you think bad thing. However you envision it, so long as you think it's bad, I can at least respect you somewhat. Now, here's the question. Is it economically beneficial? Now, some people will say yes. Slavery is beneficial. These are usually the same people who will either say it's a necessary evil, so those who back in the day argued for keeping it, or those who say slavery built this country, since you're arguing that this country in its modern day is built on slavery, and you're saying it is beneficial to the development of a state rather than detrimental. Here's the problem with this quote, and anything resembling it. It's not true. See, slavery has a number of issues that make it economically damaging. Let's start at the beginning. No wages. See, with price signals, it's easy to value labor. So, no wages, because it's slavery, means 1. Labor is harder to value. How do you judge what someone's labor is worth without a price? Is it worth it hiring a wage worker or a slave? Stuff like that is very important for making a decision. There's also another detriment due to it. Less buying power. Since the slaves aren't paid, that means they don't have the ability to buy things, meaning less demand and function. Sure, your owner could make up for that, but then you have the issue of this 4 boxes. For those who know, there are 4 ways to really think about buying. If an owner buys for a slave, they are buying like this, which means they want low cost and don't care about quality. Sorry if it's hard to read, but essentially that is how they're buying. So if they're buying for their slaves, it's not going to be costly and it's not going to be good, which makes market signals much worse since it's easier to just produce garbage clothes for slaves. What we want is people to be here, buying for themselves, because that means they care about low cost, but also quality. See, if you consider quality, you're likely buying for you. These two aren't relevant to the slave discussion, so we can ignore them, but as you can already see by this, there's a major issue. Slavery does not do this, it does this. And since there's no wages, it's harder to value labor, well, to understand its value, and it reduces buying power and thus GDP. There's another factor in it that makes low wages bad. Lessen taxes. See, taxation is very important for the state to function. Slavery makes it harder because you're not taxing the income of people who don't have income. Kind of how that works. Furthermore, due to the fact that the government is taking money from their owner, they are not going to get nearly as much because most of what the owner is already paying is going to be paid regardless, especially in terms of property taxes. And you should also note, consumption or sales taxes would also be lower because, again, the lower buying power of the slaves. So that already worsens the economy. But there's another reason: incentives. See, with slavery, there's less reason to work. Sure, you could get injured if you don't work or don't work enough. However, there's still a very real question of, well, why do anything more than the minimum? In a system of voluntary labor, there's a very real way to incentivize greater productivity by simply offering greater financial rewards or potentially a share of profits. That is actually a very common way to do so. However, you cannot do that with slavery because, well, they're slaves. And so, there's less reasons to work, therefore, you have less productivity. We see this with a number of forced labor systems as well. If you look into Russia and serfdom, you'll realize that following serfdom's abolishment, productivity on farms actually went up. It is how the kulak class was able to be formed, because certain peasants were able to more efficiently farm following the end of serfdom, and so they were able to build wealth and thus become relatively well off for peasants. Anyways, you also need to take into account the fact that with these lower incentives, monopolies are easier to form. See, there's less incentive to get into the business of using slaves for labor, simply due to the fact that those who control slaves already have control over it. And, as we see with the antebellum South, it's quite common for these families to be very close to each other, so they are more than likely cartelizing their industry to benefit everyone involved. So you naturally have an incentive to basically stay out of it. Slavery is the pinnacle of monopolies, because you can quite literally control a person. In a free market, or really any market, because even the most regulated market is better than this, you have the obvious incentive to go somewhere else if you want to get a better job. You don't have that with slavery. Sure, a slave might try, but one, they can quite literally get caught by the police and returned, so already got law and order working against you. But also, let's say they do break free. You can't go to a place that you're familiar with, or you have to leave your family behind. No matter what, you lose. And so there's a natural incentive to stay on the farm, or whatever plantation it is, and to do as little productive work as you can without getting whipped. Not a good thing. And so these incentives, or rather lessened incentives and greater monopolies, means that the economy stagnates. Slavery leads to stagnation. Now one might ask, all right, in that case, why is it still practiced? Why did it last for thousands of years? And that's simple. People profit. Now, not all people, and even those who benefit currently from slavery, would be better off if they freed their slaves. But, in the short term, people do profit. Slavers, of course, those who enslave, profit. Planters, or owners, benefit. They especially benefit due to the cartels. And catchers benefit because they have a job. Now, all of these would likely be more profitable if slavery was abolished. Slavers can become people trying to find people a job. You can still have benefits to your position without slavery. In fact, I'd wager to guess every single one of these people would be better off in 10, 20 years without slavery. and the whole economy would be better off thanks to the incentives and effects of it. However, to most people, they don't think about that. They just think, okay, I'm this, I benefit from this, therefore this. It's why you have the fire eaters fighting so voraciously to keep slavery around. That is what they knew, and it's what they supported. Now, this idea up here can also be called the King Khan defense. Such an idea was very common in the U.S. South, hence the term, where essentially it was argued that cotton was the backbone of the U.S. industrialization effort, therefore it should be kept around. But let us speculate what would happen if, say, slavery was abolished in the 1780s. Somehow the United States government was able to convince its representatives to abolish slavery over, let's say, 20 years through gradual emancipation and compensation to slave owners, since tobacco was on its way out and they didn't know of the cotton gin yet. Let's say hypothetically that happens. Well, how would that look for those textile manufacturers? Let's use Lowell as an example. Okay, I just was making sure that Lowell was indeed the one, and it was. So, good job me for actually remembering something from AP US History. So, let's think. Here are the Lowell mills. I'll just draw a standard factory so it's easier. And here's the plantation. Growing a nice bit of cotton. Now, if you hire laborers here, let's say for 5 cents a day. I'm not going to be exact, but it costs 5 cents a day and they produce, let's say, about 20 barrels of cotton. Sorry, would it be bundles? I don't know if it'd be like hay or not, because I'm not specializing in agriculture, but let's say 5 cents a day to produce 20 barrels. Well, bare minimum, the barrels would cost 5 cents. Sorry, no. They'd probably cost 2 or 3, because you have to factor in the cost of the cotton itself plus agriculture, so let's say 3 cents, as opposed to the 2 cents it would cost with slaves. Well, that goes there, and so that's a total of, if we're going with 3 cents, 60 cents per production. Now, if this was slavery, I'd estimate, say, 15 barrels for 40 cents. Is that much better? No. Especially for Lowell, because they have less cotton going in, and thus they're unable to produce as much in terms of textiles. Assuming a barrel converts to a foot of textiles, that's 20 feet. Note, I'm just making up the numbers for the sake of ease. And if they sell it for, let's say, 6 cents, then that is a profit of $1.20. Don't know why it took me effort to think about that, if it's freaking 6 cents, but regardless. One labor's production in cotton can be converted by Lowell and its workers into $1.20. That's 60 cents a profit. However, if we assume it's the 15 barrels of cotton that they get sent for 40 cents, they convert it, and even if they sell it for the same price, that would be... So I did the quick math, you can see it here, but the difference in profit would be 10 cents. Now, that's one laborer, so given the fact that Lowell would be taking the cotton produced by many, many laborers on the plantations, you can see why that matters. That's an extra dime for one, but that really adds up with hundreds of workers producing cotton, which is later shipped to the Lowell mills. So you can see, at least from the start, why this is important. Because remember, monopolies not being formed as easily means this is likely to go down in price, and the increased incentives, and thus greater production, means this is going to be a higher number, so Lowell has the ability to effectively produce more fabric, meaning they can expand easier and make a greater profit. And of course, the former slave, now laborer, who works for a wage, profits because they actually make money. The planter makes money because they're selling more product at a higher price. And, of course, the consumer profits because they get more goods. Everyone wins without slavery. If we could just convince the people here that it's beneficial to do this rather than doing this, using chains, yes, we would have actually been better off. The issue is, it took us a long time to figure that out. Or rather, it took us a long time to stop denying it, so King Cotton reigned for way too long. There's also another side effect because slavery in several states, like the US, was gotten rid of through war. It destroyed a lot of the industry that made up those markets. For example, cotton used to be the dominant export of the South. And even after the war, they tried to restart it, but, well, it was 4 freaking years where Southern cotton wasn't able to be exported to the rest of the world. The world moved on. As a result, the South lost a massive market share and was even worse economically. If they did this from the start, not only would they have more cotton to export to the rest of the world, which is already a big deal, they also would have not had to worry about places like India or Egypt producing cotton as well, because why would you start producing cotton in those places when you can buy it cheap in America? In truth, slavery being abolished would have been beneficial for everyone early. But these guys were a big part of the people who founded this country. And even if they weren't, the fact is there are plenty of people still not willing to get rid of a system which put them at a higher level than others. Because at least the rednecks who were poor could say, at least I'm not a slave. Those former indentured servants of the South. As a result, even if we put it to vote, I would not be surprised if in the 1780s, the vast majority of citizens would not have ratified an amendment to abolish slavery. The fact is, this was a democratic mistake. We thought that if we just voted on it, we could see it compromised and eventually go away, but we couldn't, and we never should have. This is a natural right, the right to our own lives and bodies. And yet we let it fall and let slavery persist for a longer time than it needed to. As I demonstrated with my hypothetical, admittedly I made a lot of stuff up to demonstrate it because I don't know exacts. Assumedly I'm not a freaking farmer. But, as demonstrated with that hypothetical, everyone profits with slavery abolished. So it makes no sense to keep it going. But we did. Thankfully, it's abolished now. But modern slavery is still very real, and it still worsens the economy. And especially in this very globalized world, well, it certainly would be beneficial to, end the practice, even if by force. Let's see. You'd have the moral justification, greater taxation, increased economic prosperity and productivity, and you get to screw over enemies. Why aren't people just starting wars to end slavery? Well, regardless, I'll leave it at that. Have a good day. See you later.